Danton knew too much, and the guillotine of the French Revolution came for him. The spring of 1794 did not arrive in Paris with the scent of flowers, but with the metallic tang of blood and the suffocating stench of wet wool and unwashed bodies. In the narrow, mud-slicked streets of the capital, the air was thick with a peculiar kind of silence, the silence of a city holding its breath. For 2 years, the French Revolution had been a storm that refused to break, a whirlwind of idealism that had curdled into a nightmare of paranoia. At the center of this storm stood a man who seemed carved from the very earth of France itself, Georges-Jacques Danton. He was a titan, a man of thunderous oratory and gargantuan appetites, with a face scarred by smallpox and a voice that could rattle the windows of the Tuileries. He was the man who had saved the Republic when the Prussian bayonets were at the door, the man who had famously cried out for audacity, more audacity, and always audacity. But in this cold, grey April, audacity was no longer a shield, it was a target. Danton, the primary architect of the very laws that now governed the Terror, was beginning to realize a terrifying truth. The Revolutionary Tribunal, the instrument of death he had helped create to protect the people, had developed a mind of its own. It was no longer a tool of justice. It was a hungry god, and it was looking for a fresh sacrifice. To understand the tragedy of Georges Danton, one must understand the shadow he cast over Paris. He was not a cold intellectual, like those who sat in the high galleries of the National Convention. He was a man of the people, a creature of the cafes and the Cordeliers Club, a lawyer who spoke the language of the docks and the markets. When the monarchy fell on the 10th of August, 1792, it was Danton's energy that filled the vacuum of power. He was the minister of justice, yet he knew that in a revolution, justice is often the first casualty of survival. He had looked at the chaos, the internal revolts, and the foreign armies pressing in from every border, and he had made a pact with the dark side of governance. It was Danton who had argued for the creation of the Revolutionary Tribunal. He had told the Assembly that they must be terrible so that the people would not have to be. He wanted to prevent the mindless massacres of the past by institutionalizing the state's violence. He believed he could control the blade, that he could use it to prune the dead branches of the aristocracy and then put it away when the garden of the Republic was safe. But power, once tasted in the form of absolute life and death, is rarely surrendered. By the early months of 1794, the Republic was no longer in immediate danger of collapse, yet the killings were accelerating. The guillotine, once a grim necessity, had become a daily ritual in the Place de la Révolution. Danton, weary of the sight of the tumbrils and the sound of the falling blade, began to retreat. He had spent months away in his country home at Arcis-sur-Aube, seeking solace in the soil and the company of his young wife. He wanted to believe that the revolution had reached its natural conclusion, that it was time for peace, for commerce, and for the restoration of human decency. He began to lead a faction known as the Indulgents, men who dared to whisper the word clemency in a city where such a word was increasingly viewed as treason. This was his great mistake. He believed that his past services to the nation made him untouchable. He believed that he was the revolution, and that no one would dare to strike the man who had breathed life into the Republic. He misjudged the climate of Paris, and more importantly, he misjudged the man who had once been his closest ally, Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre, known as the Incorruptible, was the polar opposite of Danton. Where Danton was loud, physical, and prone to the vices of the flesh, Robespierre was slight, meticulous, and fueled by a cold, crystalline vision of virtue. For Robespierre, the revolution was not just a political change, it was a moral purification. Anyone who stood in the way of the Republic of Virtue was a cancer that had to be excised. To Robespierre, Danton's sudden call for mercy was not a sign of humanity, but a sign of corruption. He looked at Danton's wealth, his expensive tastes, and his connections to shady financiers, and he saw a man who had been bought. The tragedy of their relationship was that they both believed they were saving France. Danton wanted to save the French people from the Terror. Robespierre wanted to save the revolution from the French people's weaknesses. As the two men drifted apart, the atmosphere in the Committee of Public Safety turned lethal. The corridors of power were filled with whispers of Danton's supposed conspiracies, his secret meetings with foreign agents, and his plan to restore the monarchy. None of it was true in the way his enemies claimed, but in 1794, the truth was whatever the committee decided it was. The tension reached a breaking point in the final weeks of March. Danton's friends, sensing the tightening of the noose, pleaded with him to act. They urged him to use his immense popularity with the masses to challenge the committee, to take the podium at the convention and denounce the fanatics who were drowning the country in blood. But Danton seemed possessed by a strange, fatalistic lethargy. He was a man who had spent his life in motion, yet now he sat still as the tide rose around his ankles. When told that his arrest was imminent, he famously replied that they would not dare. He believed his legend was a suit of armor. He believed that the people would rise up to protect their favorite son. He even dismissed the idea of fleeing the country, asking his friends where he would go, for one does not carry their country on the soles of their shoes. He chose to stay, perhaps out of a stubborn pride, or perhaps because he was simply tired of the killing and no longer cared if he was the next to go. On the night of March 30th, the order was finally signed. It was a document that would change the course of history, signed by men who had once called Danton brother. Robespierre's signature was there, hesitant at first but final. The Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security had merged their fears into a single act of betrayal. They knew that arresting Danton would be the most dangerous thing they had ever done. He was still a lion, and even a caged lion could roar. They moved in the dead of night, the traditional hour of the tyrant, sending soldiers to the house on the Rue des Cordeliers. When the heavy pounding came at his door, Danton did not resist. He watched as the soldiers searched his rooms, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and a deep, weary irony. He was taken to the Luxembourg prison, a place that had once been a palace, but was now a crowded warehouse for the condemned. As the heavy iron gates clanged shut behind him, the news began to ripple through the city. The Titan had been fallen. The man of August 10th was behind bars. In the markets and the wine shops, people spoke in hushed tones, their faces pale with a new kind of fear. If Danton could be arrested, then no one was safe. The shadow of the guillotine had grown so long that it now covered every doorstep in Paris. Inside the prison, Danton found himself surrounded by those he had once opposed and those he had once led. He walked through the halls with his head held high, his booming laugh echoing off the stone walls, mocking the very walls that held him. He told his fellow prisoners that he was the one who had created this system, and now he was being served by it. It was a bitter realization. He had built a machine of pure logic and cold steel, thinking he could direct its edge, only to find that the machine had no master. It only had victims. The committee, meanwhile, was terrified. They knew that a public trial for Danton could backfire. He was the greatest orator in France. If he were allowed to speak, he might turn the mob against the government. He might remind the people of who he was and what he had done for them. To prevent this, they began to weave a web of legal deceits. They prepared a list of charges that were a frantic scramble of half-truths and outright fabrications. They accused him of being an agent of the British, of conspiring with the disgraced General Dumouriez, and of seeking to destroy the very republic he had founded. They didn't need proof. They only needed a spectacle that looked like justice. They relied on the fear of the other deputies in the convention, many of whom were secretly relieved to see Danton removed, fearing that if he survived, he would eventually turn on them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the limits of the revolution. It was to be a battle between the man of the heart and the man of the law. As Danton sat in his cell sharpening his wit for the coming trial, he knew he was fighting for more than his life. He was fighting for his place in history. He knew that the trial would be a farce, but he intended to make it a farce that the world would never forget. He was determined that if he was to go to the guillotine, he would do so while making the committee tremble one last time. The air in Paris grew colder as the date of the trial approached. The people gathered in the squares, waiting for the first glimpse of the man they had once adored, now stripped of his power and his titles, being led like a common criminal toward the very tribunal he had breathed into existence. The irony was complete, the trap was set, and the blade of the 45-pound steel guillotine was being polished for the neck of the man who had once called it a necessity. The transfer from the Luxembourg prison to the Conciergerie was more than a change of cells. It was a descent into the bowels of the revolution's finality. If the Luxembourg was a waiting room, the Conciergerie was the antechamber of the grave. Located in the heart of the Palais de Justice, its damp limestone walls sweated with the moisture of the Seine and the cold breath of thousands who had passed through its gates toward the scaffold. As Georges Danton was marched through the torchlit corridors, the heavy thud of his boots echoed like the beating of a drum. He looked at the jagged stones, the very stones that had once held Marie Antoinette and the Girondins, and he saw the irony etched into the mortar. He was the man who had redirected the course of the law to feed this monster, and now the monster was opening its maw for him. The air here was different. It smelled of vinegar, old straw, and the metallic tang of sharpening steel. The strategy of the Committee of Public Safety was now clear. They had to move fast. Every hour Danton remained alive was an hour the Republic risked a popular uprising. Robespierre and Saint-Just knew that Danton's presence in Paris was like a smoldering ember in a powder magazine. They didn't just need him dead, they needed him discredited, silenced, and erased. To achieve this, they turned to the man who had become the revolution's most efficient butcher, the public prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville. A man with the soul of a bureaucrat and the eyes of a shark, Fouquier-Tinville lived for the paperwork of death. He spent his nights refining the lists of the condemned, ensuring that the machine never ran out of fuel. For Danton, however, the prosecutor knew that ordinary procedures would not suffice. The lion had to be muzzled before he could roar. The trial began on the 2nd of April 1794. The courtroom of the Revolutionary Tribunal was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the electric tension of a city on the edge of a nervous breakdown. When Danton entered the room, he didn't walk like a prisoner. He strode in like a conqueror. He took his seat on the bench of the accused, flanked by his loyal friends, including the brilliant but fragile Camille Desmoulins. Danton scanned the faces of the jurors, men he had once shared drinks with, men who owed their positions to his patronage. He saw in their eyes a terrifying mixture of guilt and self-preservation. They were not there to judge, they were there to survive. They knew that if they did not return a verdict of death for Danton, their own names would be on the next list. Fouquier-Tinville began the proceedings by reading a long, rambling indictment. It was a masterpiece of political fiction, accusing Danton of everything from financial embezzlement to secret negotiations with the English Prime Minister, William Pitt. It was a great conspiracy narrative designed to overwhelm the senses and bypass the need for specific evidence. Danton sat through the reading with a smirk of pure disdain. When it was finally his turn to speak, he rose like a mountain. His voice, a deep, resonant thunder, didn't just fill the room, it shook the very foundations of the Palais de Justice. He didn't bother defending himself against the specific charges. He attacked the legitimacy of the accusers themselves. "My name," he bellowed, his voice carrying out through the open windows and into the streets where thousands had gathered to listen. "My name is Georges-Jacques Danton. My age, 35. My home, it will soon be in the void, but my name will live forever in the pantheon of history." The crowd in the galleries, initially hostile, began to stir. Danton reminded them of the days when the borders were falling, when the kings of Europe were closing in, and when he and he alone had the courage to call for the levée en masse. He reminded them that he was the one who had stood at the tribune while others hid in their basements. He wasn't just defending his life, he was reclaiming his legend. The jurors began to look at each other with uncertainty. The prosecutor paled. The trial was slipping away from the committee. Danton was winning. Behind the scenes, in the darkened rooms of the Committee of Public Safety, panic had set in. Reports were flooding in that the mob was beginning to cheer for Danton. The incorruptible Robespierre sat in silence, his fingers twitching over his spectacles. He knew that if Danton were acquitted, the committee would fall by evening. The revolution would take a sharp turn toward the moderate, and those who had signed the arrest warrants would be the next to face the blade. They needed a kill switch, a legal maneuver so ruthless that it would bypass the trial entirely. It was Saint-Just, the angel of death, who provided the solution. He burst into the National Convention with a fabricated report, claiming that a great conspiracy had been discovered in the prisons, that Danton's supporters were planning to break him out and massacre the convention. This was the turning point. On the third day of the trial, as Danton prepared to deliver a final crushing blow to the prosecution, a messenger arrived with a new decree from the convention. It stated that any accused person who insulted the national justice or caused a disturbance in the court could be outlawed and sentenced without further hearing. It was a gag order disguised as a law. When Fouquier-Tinville read the decree, Danton realized the depth of the betrayal. He saw that the very laws of the Republic, the laws he had helped draft to ensure the safety of the state, had been weaponized to strip him of his tongue. He was to be silenced not by logic, but by a piece of paper. "You are murderers," Danton screamed, his voice cracking with a rare moment of genuine anguish. "You are killing the Republic to save your own skins." He looked at the judges, the jurors, and the soldiers, and he saw only puppets. The trial was no longer a trial, it was a ritual execution in slow motion. Camille Desmoulins, sitting next to him, broke down in sobs. Desmoulins had been the one who had called the people to arms at the Bastille, the one who had been Robespierre's childhood friend. Now he was being discarded like a used tool. Danton reached over and placed a massive hand on Camille's shoulder, a gesture of fatherly protection even in the face of their shared annihilation. He whispered to his friend to be brave, but the light in Danton's own eyes was beginning to harden into a cold, dark resignation. In the silence of his cell that final night, the weight of his life pressed down upon him. He thought of his first wife, whom he had loved with a desperate, earthy passion, and whose body he had once exhumed just to see her face one last time. He thought of the blood he had spilled to keep the revolution alive, the September massacres, the execution of the king, the crushing of the Girondins. He had always believed that the end justified the means, that the survival of France was worth any moral cost. But now, the means were standing at his door. He realized that the revolution was not a path to a better world, but a self-consuming fire. It didn't care about virtue or justice, it only cared about its own momentum. He had helped build a machine that had no off switch, and he was simply the next piece of meat to be fed into the gears. The psychological toll was immense. Danton, the man of action, was now a man of forced reflection. He looked at his hands that had signed thousands of death warrants, and saw the invisible stains that no amount of revolutionary rhetoric could wash away. He began to understand that Robespierre was not his enemy, but his mirror image. They were both trapped in the same logic of necessity. The difference was that Danton had finally grown tired of the smell of blood, while Robespierre had learned to find it holy. As the sun began to rise on the 5th of April, Danton heard the sound he had heard every morning for years, the rattling of the tumbrils on the cobblestones of the courtyard. But this time, the carts were coming for him. The guards entered the cell to perform the toilette of the condemned. They cut his hair short at the neck, so the blade would have a clean path. They tied his hands behind his back, pulling the ropes tight until his skin turned blue. Danton submitted to it all with a grim, mocking silence. When a priest approached to offer him last rites, Danton laughed. He told the man that his life had been his confession and that the people of France were his only judges. He was ready. He was no longer a politician, no longer a leader, no longer a husband. He was simply a man prepared to meet the void he had so often spoken of. As he was led out to the courtyard, the other prisoners watched from their bars. Some hissed, some wept, but most simply stared in stunned silence. The Titan was being led to the slaughter. Danton caught sight of himself in a polished piece of metal as he passed a guard. He didn't recognize the man staring back. The face was gaunt, the eyes were hollow, but the jaw was still set in that familiar expression of defiance. He realized then that his death would be his final and most powerful act. By dying, he would prove that the terror had gone too far. He would become a martyr for the very mercy he had failed to show others. The irony was bitter, but it was all he had left. The carts were waiting, the crowd was gathering, and the long road to the Place de la Révolution was paved with the very intentions he had once used to justify the unjustifiable. The turning point had passed. The only thing left was the falling of the steel. The afternoon of April 5th, 1794, was bathed in a deceptive golden light that seemed to mock the grim procession winding its way through the heart of Paris. 2 heavy wooden tumbrils creaked under the weight of 15 men, their wheels groaning against the uneven cobblestones of the Rue Saint-Honoré. At the front of the first cart stood Georges Danton. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, his chest thrust forward, his head held high like a lion being led to a cage. He did not look like a man defeated. He looked like a man who was observing the final act of a play he had written himself. Beside him, Camille Desmoulins was a ghost of his former self, his clothes torn, his face wet with tears, screaming at the crowd to remember who they were, to remember that the men in these carts were the ones who had given them their liberty. But the crowd, the famous revolutionary mob of Paris, was eerily quiet. There were no cheers of "Long live the Republic," only a heavy, suffocating silence. The people watched as their gods were dragged to the dirt, realizing too late that when the giants fall, the earth trembles for everyone. The route to the Place de la Révolution was lined with thousands of spectators. Danton's eyes scanned the windows and the balconies, searching for a familiar face, a sign of dissent, or perhaps a flicker of the fire he had once ignited. He passed the house where Maximilien Robespierre lived, the shutters tightly closed, as if to block out the very reality the incorruptible had mandated. Danton let out a roar that silenced Camille's sobbing, a voice that carried through the wood and stone. "Robespierre, you will follow me. Your house will be razed and salt will be sown upon the earth." It was not a plea, it was a prophecy. He knew the internal logic of the terror better than anyone. He knew that by removing the indulgence, the Committee of Public Safety had removed the only thing standing between themselves and their own eventual destruction. The machine of death was now perfectly balanced, and without an external enemy to consume, it would inevitably turn inward, devouring its masters until nothing was left but ash. As the tumbrils turned into the vast open space of the Place de la Révolution, the silhouette of the guillotine rose against the late afternoon sky, like a skeletal finger pointing toward the heavens. The structure was simple, efficient, and terrifyingly indifferent. It did not care for oratory, it did not care for history. It was merely gravity and steel. The smell of the square was a thick cocktail of damp earth, horse manure, and the faint, lingering odor of old blood that the morning rains had failed to wash away. Danton looked at the scaffold, and then at the thousands of faces staring back at him. He saw the tricoteuses, the women who sat knitting while heads rolled, their needles clicking in a rhythmic mockery of the passing seconds. He realized that for the mob, this was no longer a political event. It was a spectacle. He had taught them to love the sight of the falling blade, and now they were simply enjoying the highest quality entertainment he could provide. One by one, Danton's friends were led up the wooden steps. He had to stand and watch as the men who had stood by him in the darkest hours of 1792 were strapped to the board. He heard the heavy thud of the blade, a sound like a wet cloth hitting a stone floor, followed by the dull bounce of a head into the wicker basket. Camille Desmoulins was among the first. The young man who had once sparked the fall of the Bastille died trembling, his last thoughts likely of his wife and child, victims of the very ideology he had helped birth. Danton stood firm, refusing to look away. He owed them that much. He was the captain of this sinking ship, and he would be the last to go under. Each time the blade fell, a small part of the old republic died with it. The crowd remained silent, perhaps beginning to feel the cold realization that the man who had called for audacity was being silenced by the very audacity he had preached. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, a man who performed his duties with the weary professionalism of a clockmaker, stepped forward to lead Danton to the stairs. Danton's massive frame seemed to dwarf the scaffold as he ascended. The wood groaned under his weight. When he reached the platform, he stood for a moment, looking out over the city he had ruled and the people he had saved. He saw the towers of Notre Dame in the distance, the rooftops of the Cordelier district, and the winding ribbon of the Seine. He was 34 years old, at the height of his physical and intellectual powers, and yet he was seconds away from becoming a footnote. He did not ask for mercy. He did not offer a prayer. Instead, he turned to Sanson with a look of pure, unadulterated command. "Don't forget," Danton said, his voice low but firm, "to show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." It was the ultimate act of vanity, or perhaps the ultimate act of defiance. Even in death, he wanted to be the center of the frame. He was strapped to the plank, his neck positioned in the wooden collar known as the lunette. For a few agonizing seconds, he stared down into the darkness of the basket, the scent of sawdust filling his nostrils. He was Georges-Jacques Danton, the Titan of Paris, the man who had defied kings and moved armies. And then the release mechanism was triggered. The 45-pound steel blade slid down its tracks with a hiss of cold friction. There was no scream, only the sudden, sharp end of a life that had burned too bright for the world it inhabited. Sanson did as he was told. He reached into the basket, gripped the hair of the severed head, and held it high for the masses to see. The face of Danton, scarred and powerful even in the stillness of death, stared out over Paris one last time. The aftermath of Danton's execution was not the era of peace Robespierre had envisioned. Instead, it was the beginning of a fever dream. With Danton gone, the last voice of reason was extinguished. The Great Terror accelerated, the law of 22 Prairial was passed, and the Revolutionary Tribunal began to send people to the guillotine in batches of 50 or 60 a day. The city became a ghost town of suspicion. Neighbors denounced neighbors, brothers denounced sisters, and the Committee of Public Safety became a cabal of terrified men looking for the next traitor in their own ranks. Robespierre, the architect of this Republic of Virtue, found himself increasingly isolated. Danton's prophecy began to haunt him. He had killed the only man who could have balanced his idealism with pragmatism, and in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. Less than 4 months after Danton's head fell into the basket, the cycle reached its inevitable conclusion. On the 27th of July, 1794, the 9th of Thermidor, the National Convention finally revolted against the incorruptible. Robespierre, the man who had used the law to murder his friends, was declared an outlaw. In a chaotic struggle, he was shot in the jaw, rendered unable to speak, and dragged to the same conciergerie cell that Danton had occupied. The irony was absolute. On the 28th of July, Robespierre was led to the same scaffold in the Place de la Révolution. The crowd that had watched Danton in silence now erupted in cheers of joy as the blade fell on the man of virtue. The terror ended not with a grand treaty or a change of heart, but with the exhaustion of a nation that had seen too much blood and realized that the guillotine was an appetite that could never be satisfied. The story of Georges Danton is the story of the revolution itself, a magnificent, terrifying explosion of human potential that was consumed by its own contradictions. He was a man of immense flaws. He was greedy, he was loud, and he was often ruthless. But he was also a man who understood that a nation cannot live on bread and virtue alone. It needs a soul, and it needs the capacity for forgiveness. His error was not in his lack of belief, but in his belief that he could control the chaos he had unleashed. He thought he could use the tiger of the mob to hunt his enemies, and then put it back in its cage when the work was done. He failed to see that once a people are taught to solve their problems with the blade, they will eventually see every problem as a neck. Today, the Place de la Révolution is known as the Place de la Concorde, the Place of Harmony. The fountains play where the scaffold once stood, and tourists take photographs where the blood of the Father of Liberty once pooled in the dirt. But if you stand in the center of the square when the sun is setting and the city noise fades, you can almost hear the echo of a thunderous voice. You can feel the weight of the shadow cast by the man who knew too much, the man who tried to stop the blade he had sharpened. Danton's legacy is a warning that echoes through every century, that power is a ghost that haunts those who seek it, and that the most dangerous thing in the world is an ideal that has lost its humanity. The guillotine did not just take Danton's head. It took the heart of the Republic, leaving behind a lesson written in steel and silence. The revolution devours its children, but it always starts with the ones who loved it the most.